Hi, everyone. This video is part of the Debaters Council's initiative to have a series of debriefs on motions. Specifically, this round of videos is related to debriefs on motions set at the DS Impromptus 2024 tournament. And I, in this video, will be handling the quarterfinals motions, walking through some of the questions I feel debaters should have when they see the motion, and getting into some lines of analysis as well. But before that, a bit about me. My name is Anna. I was a member of the national team for debate in 2021, representing Sri Lanka at WSDC. And since then, I've been involved in both coaching and adjudicating. And most recently, I am a member of the Debaters Council of Sri Lanka. So the quarterfinal motion at this tournament was under the theme of feminism. And before we actually get into the analysis and the debrief, I'll read the info slide and motion for clarity, but do bear with me because it's a bit long-winded. So the info slide essentially reads, Queen Anula of Anuradhapura was the first queen in Sri Lankan history to have wielded meaningful power and authority, as well as the first female head of state in Asia. Anula initially rose to power as consort of King Chore Naga, son of King Valagamba of Anuradhapura. However, in her 5-year reign, she poisoned at least 4 other husbands and consorts, and she eventually governed Rajarata on her own. The motion reads, this house believes that Queen Anula should be celebrated in Sri Lankan history. Now, there's 3 notes that I want to make about this motion in general before we get into more specific lines of analysis for both proposition and opposition. The first thing to say is this is quite obviously a niche motion. It's about Sri Lankan history, but very specifically about this particular figure, Queen Anula. And I know the instinct for a lot of teams is to freak out when they see motions like this. There is this false assumption that you need to have a ton of historical knowledge, but that's not true. Essentially, when you see motions like this that are super niche, judges don't expect you, and in fact wouldn't encourage you to make this a debate about historical fact. But when you see motions like this, essentially the unique circumstances are used to create a moral dilemma or a hypothetical world or a social issue for debaters to assess and then argue. It isn't a motion about international relations. It isn't a motion about current affairs. In which case, if it was, there would be a reasonable expectation that you should know some of what's happening and have some background knowledge. It would enrich the debate. But when you see a motion like this, for example, I've seen motions that use Greek and Roman mythology. There's no expectation for you to bring in, very obscure and, esoteric examples or, fact. It's more so about taking what the info slide provides you and what the motion provides you and making your arguments based on that. So essentially, to make this short, do not be scared about how niche the motion seems. There's no expectation that you should know these, obscure facts. If you make logical arguments, if you use reason, if you use, levels of analysis that intuitively make sense, if you can justify what you're saying, that's more than enough. Okay, in terms of how to address the motion. Now, one strategic thing that I would say is that when you see motions like this, it's very important to identify all the pieces of information that are going to be relevant to you and not ignore anything. The reason I say this is because there's a tendency for teams to ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to motions, because it's easier to avoid dealing with the opposition or the proposition's strongest rebuttal or response to you by just ignoring it in the motion and just focusing on everything that you can extrapolate, which is actively beneficial for your side. I would not recommend this approach in prep for the simple reason that you're going to lose out on valuable responses. You're not going to have as robust and as complex, or rather as well thought out a case, because you're going to be ignoring pieces of information that are relevant. So what I like to do is to address all the pieces of information that are immediately obvious about the motion and categorize them according to, information that is obviously and immediately good for my case, pieces of information that are somewhat detrimental. It's things that I need to hedge against when I'm developing my case. It's something I need to figure out my stance on. Do I respond to this? Do I concede that this harm exists? And then that last category is information that is relevant to the motion, but you're not exactly sure if it helps you, if it hurts you. You don't know essentially what you're going to do with that piece of information yet. So, for example, if we're looking at this motion from proposition's perspective, the obvious piece of good information is the idea that Queen Anula is a strong leader. She's highly influential, and she was able to do what a lot of men in her era weren't successful at doing, perhaps, but certainly not certainly something a lot of women in her era struggle to do. So the obvious good thing on proposition, if you're going to propose that she should be a celebrated historical figure, is the idea that she's a good leader. And this makes a lot of intuitive sense because you can derive a lot of analysis on how this is empowering, how you need inspirational female role models, etc. So that's a piece of obviously good information. But the piece of obviously bad information for your side, or contentious information, is that yes, she was powerful, but she also did bad or immoral things. She killed her way to the top. She poisoned 4 husbands. So not only was she, implicated in, gray actions, but she actively killed. She actively committed, what is considered by most people to be an objective wrong. So that's the obvious bad piece of information that you need to deal with, is that she was perhaps not, she did have blood on her hands. She did do things that were considered to be wrong. And then the third category, information that seems relevant and is likely to be important in the dynamic of the debate, but you're not exactly sure what to do with it yet. And in this case, it's the fact that Queen Anula is a privileged figure. Yes, she's a leader, but she's not exactly the, completely oppressed, completely resourceless, victim. She was born in a relative point of privilege. She was consort before she became queen. So it is a reasonable guess to say that she was probably better off than a lot of other women in this era. Now, is this information that is obviously beneficial to you or obviously detrimental to you? We don't know yet, but it's important to address that and identify that at the very top of this debate. Okay, the next thing that's important when it comes to addressing the motion in prep itself is looking at some of the key terms. So in this debate, one of the important things to identify is that both proposition and opposition need to figure out how they look at the term celebration. What does it mean to be a celebrated figure in Sri Lankan history? And conversely, what would it mean to not celebrate Queen Anula in Sri Lankan history? What would happen to her legacy? How would we remember her? So the tip that I would provide here and the strategy that I would provide is to be as comprehensive as possible as you can with fleshing out what it means to be celebrated. The more, especially with a motion like this that is highly theoretical, that deals with a lot of principles, that deals with rhetoric, that deals with feminist narratives, the more relevant your motion becomes to the real world, the more accessible it becomes to the judge who's listening to you, the more impactful your arguments mean. It goes from this theoretical concept to something that is actually in fact impactful, can affect people, etc. So it's important to establish and try and flesh out as much as you can what celebrated looks like. So in proposition, some ideas that I had was that she would be seen as a figure who's not just highly influential and very important in the course of history, but she would be seen as a figure who is actively good, or a figure who on net had more of a positive impact. So she's not just important and influential, but she's a force of, she represents what it means to be a successful woman and what you would consider to be inspirational. And part of this celebration is inherently tied to the inspirational parts of the story, the struggle that she had in her rise to success, the challenges that she faced in a patriarchal society, the political rivals that she faced, which also important to note were mostly men. So it's impossible, or rather, her success and her and the difficulty of achieving that success is intrinsically linked to the celebration, because we celebrate how difficult it was for her to achieve these things, especially as a woman of her era, where there was so much more barriers in terms of being an important leader. And again, the last thing that I want to emphasize here when it comes to analysis and how you approach your analysis, try and be as realistic and make it real world relevant. There's nothing wrong with having theoretical arguments. In fact, a lot of good arguments are based on, very strong justifications, but the more you are able to make it seem like your levels of analysis are relevant, the more likely it is that you're going to have judges buy into your argument. So I know that sounds a bit vague. We'll put a pin on that, and I'll make a note of it when we do get to the actual analysis. On opposition, in terms of what celebration looks like, I think you can argue that even if you don't celebrate Queen Anula as this celebrated or rather good or inspirational figure, you could still recognize that she's influential in the same way that you would recognize that obviously as a queen she had some impact, but you would frame her as somebody who is morally gray. She did some good things perhaps and most probably, but she was also she also killed for her own self-interest. She also leaned in to the patriarchal methods of gaining power. She was probably oppressive in some ways as a leader, and some people likely suffered under her reign. These are all things that you can establish, which essentially prove that yes, she was influential, but we would see her as a morally gray figure. We wouldn't celebrate her because celebrating her would erase or dismiss the harm that she did as negligible compared to the success she has achieved or all the good that she was part of during her reign. I think also an important thing that you can add on proposition is that coming back to the counterfactual for the proposition is that if you don't celebrate Queen Anula, how likely is it for Queen Anula as a historical figure to be seen as this, neutral, as opposition says, morally gray character? Or how likely is it for her to be demonized given existing patriarchal norms? Now, this is something we'll get more into with argumentation. So prop lines of argumentation. So the one obvious thing to me that stands out about this motion is about what celebration does. And on prop, you could argue that celebration uniquely helps to reclaim and establish female narratives. Part of making this argument is understanding what exactly is wrong with existing narratives surrounding women or women role models. Specifically, to me, it's two things. One, there's a common perception that women are weak and unintelligent, which makes them unsuitable in leadership positions compared to their male counterparts. They don't have the grit to make the hard calls. They're likely to be overly emotional. They do not have the same, brain and brawn that it takes to be a leader. The second problem in the narrative that I see is that there is this insanely high standard that is set to be seen as successful or as inspirational as a woman. You are expected to be virtuous. You are expected to be self-sacrificing. This is not the same expectation that you have of male leaders or male role models, where their ability to gain success and follow their ambition is seen as something that is a net good, and whatever harm that occurs, if it's a king who had to make certain killings, that's a political move, that's a necessary evil. But with a woman, that's cunning, that's evil, that's manipulative. So how does celebration change any of this on propositions? One, you could argue that it directly contradicts this ideal because it changes the perception that women are weak and unintelligent. Queen Anula is perhaps the strongest example you have for how intelligent a woman can be, how she can manipulate existing patriarchal systems and oppression and still come out on top, that she's able to quite literally take out her male rivals who are actively seeking to cut her out of the system and instead emerge as a champion instead. I also think that one thing you can do, again, to make this more meaningful and impactful is to make comparisons to what is typically considered to be a female role model. So if you're looking at historical role models in a Sri Lankan context, the entire story of Vihara Mahadevi, and the reason she's celebrated is because she literally sacrificed her life for the greater good of the nation. It's not that she particularly achieved anything individually or independently, but she was able to give up her life go through suffering, endure pain, be selfless for the common good of mankind. This isn't a South Asian example, but a similar example can be seen in the story of Joan of Arc, where she had this brief, this need to rally for her country, but essentially what she's remembered for is being a martyr, for literally being burnt because she believed in her ideals. And that's something that people found virtuous. The idea that a woman must sacrifice all, and that is seen as inspirational. Whereas when it comes to male kings like Dutugamanu or what have you, their ability to deal with political rivals, to kill, are all seen, as I said before, as necessary evils when it comes to their path to progress. So I think establishing those examples are really important in terms of making your argument about narratives more effective, because it shows you the double standard that exists that you're trying to correct for. Because one important thing, and I also mentioned this, there's a tendency that teams have to take the most obvious line of argumentation and to keep using that because it's a strong and obvious line of argumentation. But there is value in attempting to think about why that narrative is important, because it's not just that it changes the perception of women as intelligent, or that it, creates a space for, a world where you don't need to be self-sacrificing to be seen as a successful woman, but it also normalizes the idea that women aren't bad or inherently evil if they choose to do things for their own benefit, because the existing social pressure is that women should sacrifice for the greater good, whether it comes to things like motherhood, or, their careers. They're always expected to not prioritize their own self-interest. And that is perpetuated by the type of role models that we assign as female role models that should be looked up to. The feminist narrative here should counteract that and tell you that, similar to male counterparts, it's okay for them to make selfish decisions in order to preserve their interests. And Queen Anula is the epitome of that. In addition, you can use some rhetoric here to also strengthen your case, and argue that feminism should reject the idea of perfection being essential in a woman for her to be successful. It's not about her doing everything right. Queen Anula, as the info site suggests, did bad things, but these are necessarily political, and you could argue that, that she's a product of her time in that sense, that she did not do something that was radically bad, but did something that was that, her counterparts did, her predecessors did, and her successors were likely to do. Another important thing that you need to do on proposition is that you need to double down into why this is unique to your side, i.e., why celebration uniquely is what leads to these benefits in narrative, and why the mere discussion of Queen Anula's story won't achieve this. Because I think on proposition, you need to be charitable to the idea that, because she's such a legendary and iconic figure, she's probably still likely to make her way into history books. So there's a couple of reasons that I thought of for this. One is that you inherently devote more time to learning about figures that are celebrated. Just because they become inherently tied to national pride, you take more of an interest in learning about them, and therefore we just devote more resources to understanding her story. Secondly, and this is perhaps the most compelling line of argumentation, is that if you don't celebrate them, it's very easy for these figures to be actively demonized because of the existing social narrative surrounding women. The third thing that I thought of here is that because of the sheer volume of male role models, it's important on a quantitative level to be able to balance the scales and show women that there are role models they can look up to. So these are the reasons why celebration is uniquely important when it comes to fixing that narrative. Another argument idea that I had is on proposition is an analysis related to why celebration of her story would inherently reveal the difficulties associated with being a woman that feminism seeks to highlight. For example, the story of Anla isn't one that's easy. She had to kill her way and play into the intricacies of a patriarchal system. Similarly, as we discussed before, she's likely to have come from a privileged background. There's a tendency both within the feminist movement and outside the feminist movement to not have a lot of sympathy or to view the struggles of quote unquote privileged women as something that doesn't fall under the umbrella of feminism. But the story of Queen Anna shows how there is, this vulnerability that cuts across a lot of women, that a lot of women, despite how privileged of a life they're born into, faced structural disadvantages, that Queen Anula had a lot of pushback when it came to establishing her power as a leader, regardless of the fact that she was born into a kingly family. Yes, you can acknowledge that she was privileged, but there are also parts of her story that are probably universal to the oppression of other women. These are the things that would come forth. It might suture the rift in feminism between, the perceived privileged members, or more privileged women who have more socioeconomic resources and those who have less. And ultimately, you can argue that this particular role model, that is Queen Anula, sheds light on how you can still be a victim of the system and still be a survivor and still be somebody who's inspirational. For example, she had to be a consort. She had to go through the struggles associated with being a queen, and dealing with the men in her life before she was able to successfully unify Rajarata and establish her legacy. So these are all important levels of analysis that you can use on proposition. Now to look at some of the argument ideas and analysis for the opposition. So as I said before, it would probably be strategic to frame this as a world where you don't celebrate her, but you do recognize that she's an important figure, but morally great, not deserving of the celebration that we heap on her. So the most important level of analysis here is dealing with this core claim that proposition gives you about how it's important to deal with the double standard that exists with men, where men can do bad things and still be seen as successful and inspirational. But the opposition here would have a different approach, which is to say, yeah, we wouldn't celebrate Queen Anula, but we don't want to celebrate these men either. The problem is the types of role models, the type of male role models that we often find inspirational, we dismiss the harm that they do. And oftentimes the harm that these kings or other role models or inspirational figures, they are complicit in harming some of the most vulnerable members of society, whether it be minorities, women, the poor. And it's often all of these harms are kind of dismissed as necessary things that they need to do in their path to success. The problem is it becomes so much harder to criticize the actions of male role models or male success stories or historical figures if we support figures like Queen Anula, who are also part of the same patriarchal system. So importantly, the underlying principle here is that feminism isn't necessarily about supporting each and every woman as much as it is about protecting women from being vulnerable or exploited. In this case, the reason why it's analogous here is that, yes, Queen Anula is a woman, but does she represent the interest of feminism? Or would celebrating her essentially sugarcoat and whitewash the actions of male historical figures by normalizing it in a way that becomes harder for the feminist movement to criticize? You can also argue that she isn't a feminist figure and she didn't do anything particularly inspirational because she played into patriarchal institutions as opposed to challenging their existence. For example, she's known for killing in order to become queen, as opposed for criticizing the institution of patriarchy, the institution of monarchy that was typically held by men. This shouldn't be celebrated. We shouldn't be celebrating the upholding of patriarchal figures. And essentially what happens is that she is used as a token historical figure to make it seem like these patriarchal institutions were ones that were inclusive of women. A strategically important thing that you can do here with your analysis is to say that because she's the first head of state, to celebrate her would A, ignore the harm she was complicit in directly, or B, suggest that it is less than the sum total of her personal achievement. So essentially all the bad she does is essentially pushed under the rug. A second important piece of analysis that would be relevant for the opposition is to talk about the precedent that this narrative sets. Success is inherently tied to her position of relative privilege and her complete willingness to abide by the patriarchal institutions. This essentially means that it tells people that it's okay to take advantage of other women, of other oppressed communities, as opposed to changing the system. Secondly, it would whitewash historical realities. We think it would be far more compelling on opposition if you were to argue about how the absence of female role models itself would lean into discourse, because it creates this question of why weren't there female role models? Because it's structurally impossible, or because the patriarchal systems were so strong, it was hard to overcome those issues. So we think, or rather the opposition would think, that is a much more important line of discourse than celebration does, because it leads to this question of why there was a vacuum in terms of female role models, as opposed to making it seem like actually these institutions did have space for women. And essentially the underlying principle here is that women shouldn't have to change for the system must change for them. That's essentially all the analysis that I had in terms of the way that I approach motions, the questions that I have. In essence, try to take these theoretical, abstract, somewhat difficult motions and make them more believable to judges. Think of examples that are close to home. Think of examples that make sense, and think about not just like why it's important to celebrate a person, but practically how does that celebration work? How does it work in classrooms, in history classes? How do people interact with these narratives? Essentially, that's how I would approach this motion. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to comment them down below and have them answered.